So today, I want to talk to you about a substance that at one time drove the very course of the Roman Empire. This substance had wars fought over it, and it also had tremendous value granted to it. Now you're probably thinking we're going to be talking about a precious metal, perhaps gold or silver. But that's not what we're going to talk about. It's actually something each and every one of you have in your home. Probably have a giant bag of it in your garage because we're going to be throwing it out on the ground very, very soon. It's salt. Now today we're going to explore two aspects of salt. The first aspect is that salt preserves and it's changeless. And the second aspect is salt's value throughout history. And our goal today will be to better understand the scriptures that talk about salt by exploring those two aspects. Now, prior to the reading I had done on this subject, I really had not given salt much thought. Of course, we know too much of it can be a bad thing. And again, it's very handy for melting all that ice that we're going to have on the ground. But if that's as deep as our thinking goes about salt, we're going to be missing some of the deeper symbolic meanings that Scripture has for us when the Scriptures talk about salt. And a while ago, I came across a book. If you're interested in salt, this might be helpful for you. It's entitled Salt, A World History by Mark Kurlansky. And he was, in that book, he's talked about it as early as 6000 BC that civilizations, specifically ancient China, were actually starting to harvest salt. Now, they didn't know it then, but it's something that we quite literally need to survive. We use salt to maintain fluid in our blood cells. It's also how those electrical signals get transmitted through our body along the nerves. Now, the ancient Chinese did realize that salt played a critical role in preserving food. And that brings us to our first aspect of salt, how it is a preservative. Now, when you're thinking ancient civilizations, preserving things, you might think Egypt. Now, it's no surprise that, like the Chinese, the Egyptians were also making use of salt. They had learned to store up goods, and it helped them to expand their trade. And for those who aren't aware of how salt actually preserves food, here's a quick overview from the book that I mentioned. And I quote from Mr. Kurlansky. Curing flesh in salt absorbs the moisture in which bacteria grows. Furthermore, the salt itself actually kills bacteria. So another way you can put this, salt fights off corruption. Now it's in that light we're going to turn to our first scripture today, and let's open up to Leviticus chapter 2. We're going to read verse 13. So again, this is Leviticus chapter 2 and verse 13. Now here we're talking through how the offerings were to be presented. And then in verse 13 we have a further instruction about the grain offering. And every offering of your grain offering you shall season with salt. You shall not allow the salt of the covenant of your God to be lacking from your grain offering. With all your offerings you shall offer salt. So God is very explicitly saying salt is to be included with every single offering that's presented, not just the grain offering. And there are a few other scriptures that cover this. I don't have time to go through them, but you may wish to note down Ezra chapter 6 and verse 9, Ezekiel chapter 43 and verse 24, and Mark chapter 9 and verse 49. Now to get back to Leviticus 2 and verse 13, when I read through this, two questions come to mind. The first question is this: why did God command that salt was to be included in every offering? Well, that's a very easy one to answer. Salt was acting as the symbol of incorruption, the very opposite of what leaven would represent. And the Jamieson, Fawcett, and Brown commentary puts it this way: the same reasons which led to the prohibition of leaven recommended the use of salt. If the one soon putrefies, the other possesses a strongly preservative property, and hence it became an emblem of incorruption and purity. So that's pretty straightforward. The other question that came to my mind, that was a more difficult one to answer. What does the scripture mean when it says the salt of the covenant of your God? Is there a specific type of salt that we're supposed to be using? Does it mean we're supposed to be using kosher salt rather than the iodized salt? Well, no, that's a facetious way of putting it, but of course that's not what the scripture is getting at. Salt here is not just a symbol of incorruption. It's a symbol of being changeless. Even if you were to dissolve the salt that you have in your home, put it in a glass of water, you can evaporate that water back out, salt's back just as it was before. And that is how the covenant that God made with the patriarchs was meant to be. Adam Clarke puts it this way in his commentary. It was called the salt of the covenant of God because as salt as is incorruptible, so was the covenant made with Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and the patriarchs. And the JF&B adds that the use of salt here signifies a perpetual covenant, a perfect reconciliation, and a lasting friendship. Now this symbolism carries on to us today through Christ's message, which is unchanging and also helps to preserve us. Now we'll move on to the second aspect of salt and its value that it's had throughout history. Now in ancient Egypt, they created their salt by evaporating seawater, and they also got it through trade in Africa. They would have very much liked to have exported salt, but it was simply too bulky just to send shipments of salt. So instead, they sent their salt in the form of preserved foods. And trade in salted food actually shaped economies in that region for over 4,000 years. Now, salt was valuable because it was needed to survive. It was needed to preserve foods, and of course, it also provided some flavoring to what they were preparing. But most critical was the perceived scarcity of salt. Today, we know that salt is literally found everywhere throughout the world. But that wasn't always the case. Prior to the 20th century, salt was something that was desperately searched for, traded for, and fought over. For millennia, salt literally represented wealth. So in that light, the tremendous value that salt had, let's go to our next scripture, and we'll find that over in the book of Matthew, chapter 5. And here we're going to read one verse, verse 13, but we're going to break it apart a little bit. So this is Matthew chapter 5 and verse 13. You are the salt of the earth. Now right off the bat, Christ is telling us that we are very valuable to him. And why is it that we're valuable? It's because we can act as salt, preserving by eliminating corruption, both in ourselves and around us as we're able to. Now this is an amazing opportunity that we have, and it's challenging. Being called the salt of the earth, that we can take tremendous encouragement from that. But there's a warning that goes along with that title that we're given. And we see that in the second half of verse 13. But if the salt loses its flavor, how shall it be seasoned? It is then good for nothing but to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. Now the implication here is very plain, but again, with these other scriptures with salt, there's a deeper understanding. And for that, we need to understand how salt can lose its flavor. And if salt is supposed to be changeless, it's incorruptible, well, how could something of that lose its flavor? And for pure salt, that is a nearly impossible thing to happen. Pure salt will not lose its flavor. But in ancient times, when these scriptures were written, salt was not always pure. Salt would be commonly mixed with other ingredients. And then if that salt was left out, exposed to the elements, the humidity, the salt would actually end up leaching out. And what you had left, it would look like it was good salt to use, but when you would taste it, you'd realize that the saltiness was actually gone. And at that point, it was only good for one thing, to be thrown out on the ground, just like we're going to be doing here very soon for traction on our walkways. And that is where the danger for us lies. While we are called to be the salt of the earth, we have to be careful not to mix in anything else that does not belong. Because if that happens, we can very easily lose our saltiness. And at that point, Christ himself is saying there's nothing to be done. At that point, we might find ourselves excluded from God's very kingdom. And this would not be due to any failing of God's promises, because it falls to us to ensure that we're doing our part to eliminate corruptions from our lives, just as salt does in food. Now, for a very simple substance, something that we all have, salt carries a lot of symbolism for us. And just as pure salt does not change, God himself is changeless. Just as salt can preserve, God's very word can save and preserve us. And just as salt had great value, God highly values each and every one of us. Now, we should all be striving to eliminate that any corruption in our lives, so that on that final day, God will deem us to be worth our salt.